In fact, I think that many of our countries are not able to fully take advantage of China's model of development, of its offers of aid and solidarity, many times because we live with governments that don't even have the full interest of the people at hand. There are major political deficits. China, in many ways, is the ultimate success story of what the dreams and aspirations of all the global South are. To achieve prosperity, to achieve economic well-being for its people, to ensure human dignity, what China has achieved is in many ways due to the fact that China has a socialist system, that China had a revolution that brought together millions of peasants and working people together to build something new. That would not have been possible any other way. I also firmly believe that China is a good faith partner in the development of itself, but also of the global South. I think that in particular, what I have learned, not just from reading, but from seeing it in many places across the global South, in Latin America, in Africa, in other parts of Asia, is that China doesn't come to impose any political or economic agenda. On the contrary, it often has to manage and deal and interface with what are the local agendas in each of our countries. The sad part of the reality is that China comes into many of our countries in a moment when we don't always fully own or determine our own futures. That is a major challenge that we face. In fact, I think that many of our countries are not able to fully take advantage of China's model of development, of its offers of aid and solidarity, many times because we live with governments that don't even have the full interest of the people at hand. There are major political deficits. They have to face the question of sovereignty and independence, about are they really able and capable of ensuring their ability as countries to set their own agendas, to set their own policies. That is almost difficult or nearly impossible in a world in which US hegemony continues to reign. The global South faces multiple crises: the crisis of war, the crisis of climate catastrophe, the crisis of everyday violence that tears families and communities apart. The US often says that socialism is a failure, and they want to point out at examples and say Cuba is a failure, or Vietnam is a failure, or China is a failure. Where do we see the triumph of capitalism? Cuba has to face the harshest restrictions when it comes to importing food, importing fuel, importing medicine. Some countries can subsidize, some countries can take other economic measures. But what happens when a government, an island of 11 million people, is prevented from taking even the most basic measures because it has probably the most comprehensive set of unilateral coercive measures, what we call sanctions, on top of them? So it's almost a cruel joke to say, the Cubans, they can't seem to sustain themselves. They can't seem to be able to organize themselves. They can't seem to be able to live well, but yet the West and the US government in particular do everything possible to prevent the Cuban people from doing that for themselves. I would say exactly 200 years ago, the US, its government, its leaders, its political class has always believed that Cuba, and this is a statement that goes back 200 years by John Quincy Adams, that Cuba was a ripe fruit that would fall into the hands of the US eventually. They always understood that it was under its sphere of influence and that it had to be dominated and under the control of the US. Obviously, there's been a problem with their assumption, and that the Cuban people have always resisted not just Spanish colonialism, but all attempts to annex Cuba, all attempts to occupy Cuba, and the attempts in the last 60 years of subverting, of overthrowing the Cuban revolution and its attempts to preserve its sovereignty. And that has taken place for the last 200 years, regardless of Republicans, regardless of Democrats. One has, in many ways, seen how Trump, in his administration, not only did he put 243 new sanctions on top of the already existing embargo on Cuba, but he placed Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which makes it almost nearly impossible for Cuba to have financial transactions on a normal scale with banks around the world. But literally then comes Biden, a Democrat, who has not only maintained all these policies in place, but has increased the level of hostility through foreign policy towards the people of Cuba. Is there any difference? Ultimately, all sections of the ruling class in the United States continue to see Cuba as simply a ripe fruit that, not just through nature, but at this point through force, have to be forced into the hands of the United States. We face right now a major battle of ideas and emotions. The peoples of the global south are probably subject more than anyone else to the constant onslaught of hegemonic media from the West that try to tell us what is true and what is not, who try to divide us precisely in two camps, those who are supposedly in the camp of democracy and those who are in the camps of autocracy or so-called dictatorship. And I think all media that doesn't conform to hegemonic truths, according to the West, gets banned and gets shadowed and in many ways gets censored in the forms of the West. And I think censorship today takes a new form, which is not simply to not allow you to publish, but it's to guarantee that your message doesn't get to a larger audience. I think this is a reality that we all have to face, particularly those of us in the global south who live in the West, cannot escape the reality of having to exist and operate and essentially wage out our battle for the truth on the instruments of social media created by the West. I think that we have to operate out of the principle that we have to wage our battles for the truth on their terrain as well. We cannot give them any space, any vacuums, leave any space untouched in our battle.